All right, so to our second and final postmodernist here, we discussed Baudrillard on Thursday, the work of Baudrillard, a French contemporary sociological theorist. And today I want to talk about the work of Lyotard, who wrote among other things, of course, all of these theorists are prolific, and they all produce concepts and ideas that are of note, of great import. That's why we're discussing them. Probably out of his collection of publications, The Postmodern Condition is the one that stands out as the most pronounced. The Postmodern Condition, a report on knowledge. The publication of The Postmodern Condition earned Lyotard worldwide acclaim and laid the groundwork for key developments in postmodern theory. The Postmodern Condition, as the subtitle suggests, a report on knowledge, is primarily concerned with knowledge. The Postmodern Condition, a report on knowledge. This treatise and the thesis that Lyotard presents in this work is primarily concerned with knowledge and its changing organization in contemporary societies. That the type of knowledge that, say, is preponderant or most salient in a society changes. Right? It's Foucaultian in a certain way, as Foucault himself, also another French sociologist, was interested in knowledge and the changing forms of knowledge or the changing regimes of truth that dominated particular eras, right? Epistemes, how that knowledge changes from time to time. Lyotard sketches a series of broad changes in the character of knowledge, identifying different periods of time in which different types of knowledge are predominant. So he's able to do, this is quite popular, a popular approach when analyzing things historically, of course, is to periodize, right? That there are periods, right? Or maybe think back to last week with Baudrillard, right? There are different periods in which different types of simulacra dominate, right? There's a different mode, if you will, of representation for each period of time. So there were those 4 different eras of representation. And according to Baudrillard, the current era, the postmodern era, is characterized by hyper-reality. That our representations don't refer to anything anymore. They simply refer to themselves. It's very distant. And we're very distant than, say, the time of the Mona Lisa and that era of representation, the era of the counterfeit, in which the painting referred to an actual person. In the age of hypermodernity, the metaverse refers only to the metaverse, right? The form of representation refers back to itself, that it sort of becomes its own reality, which may be preferable to reality as we know it. So what he's able to do then is to analyze the production of knowledge and the salience of different types of knowledge within pre-modern, modern, and postmodern eras, looking at how knowledge has changed over these periods of time. So pre-modern, modern, and postmodern eras. So starting first with the pre-modern era, and this is also very Durkheimian, right? This is what Durkheim did in The Division of Labor in Society, is he looked at social solidarity, but social solidarity as it functions in pre-modern societies and modern societies. And it was Durkheim's claim that in pre-modern societies, social solidarity is found in a high degree of similarity and likeness, right, which is captured by the collective conscience. So social solidarity in pre-modern societies, that is to say traditional societies, what holds those individuals together, what unites those individuals, is a similarity in, say, a worldview, or in a system of values or beliefs or attitudes, right? But as we transition to modern societies, it's Durkheim's claim that we derive social solidarity from a different source, not from a high degree of volume, say in the likeness or similarity of the values and beliefs that we share that are, say, common to the average members of society, but that we find social solidarity in a state of interdependence, particularly economic interdependence. So this is very much in line with that same style of theorizing. Again, it's not so much to social solidarity, although he does talk about the importance of solidarity. It's not so much the sources of social solidarity that Lyotard is analyzing and trying to understand how different forms of social solidarity deal with different types of society. His focus is on knowledge, the changing character of knowledge, and how the type of knowledge has changed. Again, its salience from pre-modern to modern and post-modern societies. So in pre-modern societies, narrative types of knowledge prevailed. Narrative types of knowledge prevailed. The power of the story. Greek mythology in particular, right? The power of the Greek mythological narrative. And of course, you have a cast of characters, and the gods and the titans, and they each have their experience, their origin, their experiences, and each of those experiences in those, say, titans, it tells a story, right? It communicates a story, and there's a moral to every story. So narratives tell a story. They are organized around a plot, a linear sequencing of events, a beginning and an end, and a tale of good and evil. Right? So after we have, say, Greek mythology, we have Christian mythology. Right? We have a story as to the origin of the universe, and Adam and Eve. And why is it that human beings experience so much suffering in life? Well, it's because of Adam and Eve transgressed one of the rules, one of the commandments of God. They consumed the forbidden fruit, and as a result of consuming the forbidden fruit, they were cast out of the Garden of Eden, that is to say, a state of paradise, and into the world as we know it, rife with pain and suffering. Right? The story of Adam and Eve tells the story, and we're getting there to an example of a Greek character, a titan. The same sort of moral to the story is communicated, that you will be punished if you disobey the wills and commands of God, or in the case of Greek mythology, of gods. Right? But it's the story of Adam and Eve, as it is the story of Prometheus, that communicates to individuals, this is why we follow the rules. Because when we don't follow the rules and we challenge them and we do things we're not supposed to do, then we suffer the consequences of breaking those rules. It's the power of the narrative. And it's intended to do what? The power of the narrative, of the story, is intended to shape social behavior. So do not defy the will of the gods, but rather obey. And if you obey, of course, good things will happen to you. But if you defy, then you will be met with the wrath of the punishing gods. So narratives were considered knowledge, not because they corresponded to facts. Not because they corresponded to facts, but because they conformed to social rules that fixed who had the right to speak to whom and when. You can imagine during this age, again, it's an age, pre-modern societies, by definition, are traditional societies. It's tradition that unites and holds people together. So it's the belief in a common mythology. It's the belief in, say, the virtues of Greek mythology and the virtues of the stories and messages that are being communicated. You can imagine parents reminding their children of the fate of Prometheus, who stole fire from Zeus and gave that fire to humanity. right? And as a consequence, Prometheus was punished, chained to a rock, to have his liver feasted on by an eagle during the day, only to see that liver regenerated at night so that the eagle comes back the next day and feasts on it again. Meaning, there are consequences. There will be punishments for those that violate the rules. Say, violate the rules of tradition or the authority of elders. Narratives reinforce the organization of pre-modern societies and thus promoted social unity. So this is an iconic picture by Peter Paul Rubens, who was a Flemish artist. So this was back in the 17th century, and this is titled Prometheus Bound. So here you see Prometheus bound in chain to the mountainside, and here you have an eagle feasting on the liver of Prometheus, and that is punishment for doing what? Defying the will of Zeus. He tricked Zeus and found a way to bring fire to humans. And this is his punishment. Right? And his liver will regenerate every night just to be feasted on by the eagle the next day. Flemish artist. So modernity in contrast to this era. Right? Modernity in contrast represents an assault on narrative knowledge. At this period of time, we became more interested in facticity, became more interested or preoccupied with truth, right? Using scientific methods to search for truth, modern thinkers criticize the factuality of long-standing religious and mythological narratives. That is to say, we went beyond the utility of storytelling for the purpose of unity or for the purpose of creating a sense of social solidarity, right? The extent to which individuals subscribe to a common set of mythologies that maintained social cohesion in that society. Beyond the functions of narratives and storytelling to, well, let's use these new methods to ascertain the objective or the empirical truth of something. Not the story of something, but what is the truth? Right? Each mythology presents its own origin of the universe, but the physicist is going beyond, say, mythology to find empirical evidence for the creation, the beginning of the universe. These were rendered, these religious, long-standing religious and mythological narratives were rendered ignorant and superstitious. That religious narratives become seen as one of many forms of superstition. So a knowledge that had utility, practical utility, provided a sense of unity or membership or a sense of identity for those individuals. But at this age, the modern age, it's going beyond. There's an interest in going beyond storytelling. In the place of storytelling and myth-making, modernity substituted science, objective truth. In the place of storytelling and myth-making, modernity substituted science, objective truth. However, there is no direct link between science and social cohesion, Lyotard points out. Whereas scientific truth supplies knowledge, narrative supplies meaning. Narrative supplies individuals with, say, a sense of purpose or a sense of identity. So in pursuit of a new form of knowledge, Lyotard tells us, we still were urged to rely on forms of narrative knowledge that could do a better job at providing individuals with a sense of purpose and a sense of identity. Thus, Lyotard suggested modern science must in the end appeal to narratives for legitimation. But why science? Why the scientific method? I mean, Weber was very clear when he pointed this out in his discussion of value neutrality, certainly aware that the ends of science that we pursue are a consequence of what we value. That science can't tell us what to study, in other words, right? All social scientists or scientists of the natural or biological worlds, they have to make decisions as in terms of how should they make use of social sciences, or how should they make use of the scientific method in the pursuit of knowledge. That is, what should be studied. And ultimately, answering that question, what should be studied, is informed by values. So whether we should study this, or study this, or study this, is ultimately a decision made on the basis of values. That is to say, what is worthy of being studied. And so if you go to graduate school and you're asked to write a master's thesis or write a doctoral dissertation, there are a number of things that are interesting to study as it relates to human behavior. But you ultimately have to make the decision, what is worthy of studying? And the decision that you make, what to study, will be largely motivated by your values. So as much as Weber said, it is our duty to maintain a posture of value neutrality in, say, the collection of data and the analysis of data. When we choose anything to study, we're making a decision based on what we believe is worth studying, based on our values. So values intervene in shaping what we study. Science relies on a different type of narrative than pre-modern ones. These are what Lyotard refers to as grand or meta-narratives, as they give coherence and meaning to scientific practices. So, for example, the Enlightenment story of human progress justifies the practices of the natural and social sciences. We say, well, why are we doing what we're doing? We can say, well, we're doing this, we're using scientific method, we're uncovering facts, we're uncovering and ascertaining truths because this contributes to human progress, right? That's a meta-narrative. The idea that there is, in fact, progress, that there is betterment, and the betterment of society is pursued through scientific research and discovery. Scientific practices become purposeful and meaningful in terms of societal advancement. That it's the idea of societal advancement, it's the idea of progress that legitimates the pursuit of scientific knowledge. Meta-narratives were an essential feature of modernity. So we start with the pre-modern era, and that's the era of narratives. With modernity, we see two things. We see the emergence of scientific knowledge alongside a meta-narrative which stresses the importance of the use of this knowledge in the pursuit of this knowledge in terms of societal advancement. The more science, the better. The more science, the better. Yet, the defining feature of the postmodern condition is the decline of the legitimating power of grand narratives. So now we get to the postmodern era, from the pre-modern to the modern to the postmodern era. And it's Lyotard that says, actually what defines the postmodern condition is the decline of the legitimating power of grand narratives. So hopefully what comes to mind is some of the ideas that we discussed when we were discussing the Frankfurt School theorists during week 2. It's this rise of cynicism as the result of the failed projects of modernity. Meta-narratives, he tells us, are paradigmatic systems of knowledge that contain established and credible worldviews and describe a total picture of society. They provide a basis on which truth claims are made and through which the validity of knowledge is judged. So one of the theorists that comes to mind is Pierre Bourdieu, who was critical of the pursuit of universal knowledge. He said, well, in whose interest is the universal? In whose interest is the universal? In whose interest is this notion of progress? How does this notion of modern day progress benefit some people more than others? That's the cynicism that pervades our era, right? That behind every idea is an interest. And the dominance of one idea is beneficial for some, but not so beneficial for others. Examples of modern meta-narratives are the following: Marxism and its socialist variants, the democratic and progressive ideologies of the European Enlightenment, science and the quest for empirical truth, and Christianity. Events are interpreted through such meta-narratives. But what characterizes the era of postmodernity is pernicious doubt. It's doubt. It's the opposite of faith. It's doubt. Pernicious doubt. And the failures of Marxism, as the Frankfurt School theorists reflect on, the failures of socialism, the failures of communism, centralizing the means of production in the hands of the state led to what outcome? Totalitarianism, total control. The questioning that we hear today about the integrity of our democratic institutions, that whenever there's an outcome that people don't like, they say, well, that's suspect, right, of foul play, that somebody has tampered with the machinery of democracy, and the outcome is only evidence of corruption. That's the cynicism towards democratic institutions, right? We have to be able, for democracies to work, to be able to overcome that state of sore loserhood and say, okay, we didn't win this one. But there'll be other games to play with other outcomes. How should postmodernity be defined? This is the postmodern condition. The present condition is the postmodern condition. We have arrived at the postmodern condition after going through the pre-modern era and the modern era. Now we're at the postmodern era. I define postmodern as incredulity toward meta-narratives. That is to say, skepticism. Skepticism toward meta-narratives. What has led to the skepticism of meta-narratives? Why is it so difficult for us to believe in the notion of universal human progress, or believe in the integrity of our democratic institutions. That has to do with what, again, the Frankfurt School theorists theorized about. It has to do with the contradictions, the excesses, and the failures of these grand projects that so many history classes today home in on, particularly that. It's a history class that's on a particular failure where we were hypocritical, or we failed to honor promises, or we failed as a society to treat everybody equally or as sovereign individuals, right? It's the story. So many history classes, so many sociology classes are about the failures of modern societies. That they set high expectations, but weren't able to live up to those expectations. And so we hear about the failures of our society. The subjugation in the West and the totalitarianism in the East. Critics of communism will point to the totalitarianism in the East and say, well, that's the problem with communist systems. But one can also point to crises and contradictions and excesses and failures in the West. So then, what value does science have in the face of the decline of the legitimating power of meta-narratives? And he provides us with two. He gives us two answers to this question. What value does science have in the face of the decline of the legitimating power of meta-narratives? So this is the era, the postmodern era, again, is a condition in which we still have the persistence of, the existence of scientific methods, the use of scientific methods, the quest to cultivate more scientific knowledge, but also the declining power of meta-narratives, a skepticism, a pronounced feeling of doubt. Hyperskepticism is a term that some postmodernists have used to describe our condition, that we exist in a state of hyper-skepticism, that it's difficult for us to believe in anything anymore. And the minute somebody tries to convince us of something, that we say, well, what are you after? What are you up to? What's your angle? What are you trying to get out of this? Right? Well, to answer this question, he says that first, science can be justified by its social utility. Right? In a way, sort of going back to what's the justification for narratives in the pre-modern era? Well, you could say, well, they're not true, but they at least provide us with some social utility in maintaining, right, as providing individuals with a source of social solidarity. That there's utility, say, in narratives and that form of knowledge in pre-modern society. So similarly, he argues that science is justified by its social utility. The legitimacy of science derives not from its truth, but from the support it obtains from the state or the corporation. Knowledge is legitimated by its ability to enhance. This is our focus on efficiency, right? Efficiency. Knowledge is legitimated by its ability to enhance the performance and efficacy of rationalized social institutions. So what the term he uses is performativity, and also a term that Giddens uses, although we're not going to have time to cover Giddens. We're going to skip Giddens and get to Wallerstein. But of course you're free, it won't be on the exam, but you're free to read that chapter on Giddens. Performativity. Knowledge is legitimated by its ability to enhance the performance and the efficiency of rationalized social institutions. So I met with a former student earlier today, and he was telling me, he's like, have you harnessed the power of AI yet? No, I have not. But he's one of these individuals that is very much all in when it comes to that. And he's just the more AI, the better. in his opinion, right? And it has everything to do with what? Enhancing performance. It's like, oh, it's so easy to write emails these days. He says, I just talk to my phone and spits out a well-written email, and so that's it. That's sort of how do we justify the continued investment in research on artificial intelligence? Well, because of, say, in his opinion, the time that it saves one in writing emails. And he was reminded of Marx. He said, remember when we talked about, industrialization and industrialization as eliminating toil, right? It introduced new forms of toil, but the promise of mechanization is the promise of eliminating toil. That farming is very difficult work, right? But with the use of machinery, you can make farming much easier, right? And you can also produce a whole lot more in abundance. So from my former students' point of view, it's all about harness the power of AI to eliminate the toil of writing your own emails. Enhancing performance and the efficiency of rationalized social institutions. So Leotard spoke of the possible formation of a technocratic society that uses science to enhance bureaucratic capitalist state control, right? So maybe from the bureaucrat's point of view, is this new form of knowledge or scientific knowledge is beneficial because it optimizes social control. It optimizes social control. The value of scientific technological knowledge is found in its capacity to increase the system's viability. The words here, and I like this word, to optimize. To optimize. So the appeal, I suppose, at the individual level, not say the level of institutions and states and corporations, but the individual level, right, is how can you realize your goals and your objectives on the day-to-day by using, right, AI through scientific technological knowledge. The true goal of the system, the reason it programs itself like a computer, is the optimization of the global relationship between input and output. The technocrats subscribe to this idea. So it's a cynical take on it, but nonetheless, optimizing forms of social control. For this reason, knowledge is a critical resource for the maintenance and the regulation of modern societies. Institutions of state and economy are fully dependent on information processing machines. The age that we live in is the age of the computer. Think of last week for the quarter of the class that was here on Thursday or on Tuesday, right? A week ago when we talked about the postmodern condition. This level of representation, hyperreality, is only possible because of the computer. It's the computer and it's that level of technology that makes hyperreality a possibility. So this also, the computer information data also factors centrally into Leotard's analysis as well. Institutions of state and economy are fully dependent on information processing machines, computers. The value of scientific technological knowledge is tied to the computerization of society. It's tied to the rationale of enhanced or increased efficiency. But where are we going? Right? But where are we going? What's the end game? Where are we going with all of this? With the hyper-rationalization of society, continuing to excavate, to produce more and more scientific technological knowledge. Where are we headed? We can provide a short-term rationale and say, well, the reason, as my former student said, the reason the appeal of AI is because it lessens the toil of computer processing, or rather information processing. On the relationship between knowledge and power. Knowledge in the form of an informational commodity indispensable to productive power is already and will continue to be major, perhaps the major stake in worldwide competition for power. It is conceivable that the nation states will one day fight for control of information, just as they battled in the past for control over territory, and afterwards for control of access to and exploitation of raw materials and cheap labor. So now the struggle between nations becomes a struggle or a competition over data. And again, what corporations currently are sort of cutting edge as it relates to AI technologies. All of that is based on, it's more than material things, of course. Computers are material things, but there's all the engineering. There's all the knowledge that makes possible the creation of the computer and the optimization of the computer so that it can produce the knowledge that it produces. So having access, of course, to knowledge that leads to the production of a supercomputer. And with the production of the supercomputer, new information that's produced that provides a society with a competitive advantage. We're always looking for, it's no different than athletes or games. It's like every franchise and every team is looking for a new development that will provide them with a competitive advantage over competitors. That's the story of humanity, the historical struggle. Society is composed of individuals and groups that struggle and compete over scarce and desired resources. In the past, more of that resource was, say, territory. Later, it became access to raw materials, cheap labor. Today, it becomes information, data. What produces information processing machines, supercomputers that yield the type of information that can allow you to outperform a competitor. Just like the appearance of analytics in baseball, in professional baseball. I mean, it's just, it's completely transformed how players are recruited, the decisions that managers make during the game. This is another example of, as Weber would say, the rationalization of society. It's using data and statistics to provide one team with a competitive advantage over another team. So it's the control over information. Moreover, the functions of regulation are being and will be further entrusted to machines. A type of moral, the term that I heard when I was listening KCRW, or maybe it was NPR, I don't know, one of these programs, on one of these stations. Moral distancing. Oh, it had to do with the use of AI, and maybe I can talk about this next quarter when I teach my sociology board class, but the way in which applications are sorted, thousands and thousands of applications are being sorted to identify the best applicants. That it's a series of algorithms that are doing the sourcing. What's the attractiveness of that to an employer? Well, otherwise you would have to pay people, armies of people, as they used to do in the past, to sort through all of these applications using some sort of rubric, right, to identify the best candidates. But there are many studies that have shown that involved in this process of applicant selection is bias. So the idea is we can lean on AI and we can lean on algorithms in order to eliminate bias and produce candidates that are objectively the most qualified for the position. Was one of the criticisms that the contributor had to say is oftentimes it's arbitrary. It can lead to an arbitrary assessment. And we've sort of replaced bias with arbitrariness. That's another example of the rationalization of society and how we can gain a sense of moral distance between ourselves and decisions that we make. Well, it's like, well, I didn't make we built the algorithm, we set up a series of algorithms, but ultimately it was the computer that produced these as the best candidates. So we're not the ones making the decisions. It's the computer that's making the decision, entrusted to machines. The central question is who will have access to the information these machines must have in storage. Access to data. This is the postmodern condition, right? Access to information. The cloud. The cloud. Where is all that? There is no cloud. There's just giant warehouses in the state of Texas that are collecting all this information on their hard drives. Access to data is and will continue to be the prerogative of experts of all stripes. I mean, that's what ultimately Facebook evolved into, as everybody knows now. I mean, Facebook is, Mark Zuckerberg would say, well, it's a great way for you to connect with loved ones and family and friends and that sort of thing. Okay, that's true, and you can use it for that. But what was commercially viable about Facebook and now other social media firms is that it enables you access to very private information about individuals that can be sold to the highest bidder. So social media, the idea, there's sort of how it was sold, innocuous enough, right? We just want you to connect with other people. You can live a fuller life by connecting with others. You don't have to be so lonely, right? But through the exchange of information, there's a mining of personal data, the storehousing of that data, and selling that data. So that's what Facebook ultimately became. It became a corporation that was able to gather an enormous amount of personal information that was of value to corporations because that can help them more effectively, back to the importance of technological knowledge, can more effectively market goods to you. Access to data is and will continue to be in the prerogatives of experts of all stripes. Additionally, with the advent of computer-based information technology, and here we have it, again, I was just referring to Facebook, knowledge has been increasingly commercialized. And it's fascinating. We really didn't get a chance to talk about it in the context of Foucault, but for Foucault, disciplinary power depends on visibility. It really is striking. It really is shocking to me how many individuals are willing to make visible very private information, very private things that go on in their lives. It's the visibility. It's our willingness to be made visible subjects that enables disciplinary power to operate. You just don't even, you don't have to force people, in other words, to make the private public, to make the private visible. You just give them the technology and they go, okay, and they put it out there for you, they'll, on Facebook or on Instagram or YouTube or whatever it might be, the making visible of personal information, which has a tremendous commercial value. And that's what it's trying to get access to that. That's always something you have to consider when you're thinking about the project, projects, or say you're in graduate school and you're working on a thesis or a dissertation, right? You've always has to, one of the most important, because there's all sorts of interests that you may have and things that fascinate you, but it ultimately comes down to how will you get data to answer that question? You came up with and I've heard many research questions that are fantastic research questions over the years, but the problem is, how are you going to get the data and access the data that's going to help you answer that question? I mean, it's really, again, I mean, we have so many studies of different populations, and we tend to the study of certain populations than others precisely because of the availability of that information. We have the book by C. Wright Mills, The Power Elite, but wouldn't we love to know more about what goes on behind closed doors, right? Those institutional positions of power in governments, in the military, in corporations. We would love to know more. The problem is we can't get access to it unless somebody leaks the information, unless there's a whistleblower, or there's something that goes on which then compels those individuals to confess and tell the truth. Mercantilization of knowledge is how he refers to this phenomenon. Increasingly commercializing knowledge. Knowledge is and will be produced in order to be sold. Thus, research is driven by economic forces and interests. In scientific fields like medicine, discoveries are evaluated by how much money can be made. And it's another one of these things that you can point. It's right now in the Wall Street Journal. The first time I came across this article, they made the argument that, look, many have decried, many have complained about the relationship between the pursuit of medical, scientific, technological truth or data or information and its relationship with the pursuit of profit. But one article that one journalist made the argument that it was precisely because of the connection between profit making and the pursuit of a vaccine that enabled us, I didn't have anything to do with it, but us as in medical experts, to develop a COVID vaccine within 11 months. Right? It was the enormous potential for profit that drove the major private medical research firms to invest enormous amounts of capital to produce a vaccine. Right? Johnson & Johnson, Moderna, Pfizer, right? All these other giant medical corporations. But it was profitability that drove that research, in part. Also because, of course, we needed to come up with a vaccine in order so we could get back to life as we knew it prior to COVID. Medical research has succumbed to the dynamics of the marketplace as pharmaceutical companies compete to be the first to patent and market new treatments for profit. So I would say it's mixed. You can find cases and support for ventures that were driven by profit, but because they were driven by profit, vaccines were produced, that served the public good, right? But then there are also examples, many of which, that these aren't really major health concerns. And a friend of mine worked for years in a pharmaceutical company, and he's like, he was a project manager, and he went through several different jobs within these medical corporations in the Bay Area. And he's like, it's just unfortunate that we have so many people that suffer from afflictions and suffer from debilitating diseases or ailments, and we continue to invest money into finding treatments for ailments that say aren't life-threatening. Right? That's certainly, Viagra that can enhance one's quality of life, not to diminish that, of course. But I would always hear him complain about, the amount of money that we spend, the amount of money that's spent in developing pills for erectile dysfunction. Think how that money could be invested to treat forms of cancer that, if untreated, lead to the loss of life. So critics charge that today drug companies are far more preoccupied with the research and development of potentially super profitable drugs. So Prozac or Viagra or Propecia, right, which has to do with hair loss, right, hair loss. So such a perspective reflects a cynicism toward the legitimacy of the scientific pursuit of truth. Are we, the cynic would say, are we simply using the pursuit of scientific knowledge to contribute to profitability or to lead to profitability? Okay. So that's one answer to the question. Here we have our second possibility. The second possibility is an evolving postmodern science which abandons absolute standards, universal categories, and grand theories. Science is not to be abandoned. It is to be considered one of many language games, marked by its own rules, its conventions, and its aims. One of many games that we can play. Just as we talked about in the social construction of reality, on the different types of sport that exist, right? Different ways in which you can conceive of and act out physical competitive activity. Science is a language game whose aim is truth. Its rules enjoin conformity to specific methodological and conceptual conventions. Its standards of justification are centered on issues of evidence and logic. But there are other games with other rules and goals. This is one of many games that humans can play. That it has its own value. It has its own internal logic. Rules of social science are predicated on logical consistency and the production of empirical evidence. But there are other games with other rules and goals, right? So scientific knowledge has had to contend with other forms of knowledge. Ideological knowledge is an important form of knowledge. Logic is a form of knowledge that's distinct from empirical knowledge. Religious knowledge is a type of knowledge that's competed with scientific knowledge. So for Lyotard, then, postmodern society is conceived of as a multiplicity of language games. An acceptance, he would say. An acceptance of multiple conflicting discourses. An acceptance that there are, in fact, different games that can be played simultaneously. And it's not to the totalitarian urge is to take one game and universalize it. I'm going to take football, and football is going to be the only game to play, American football. And it's going to be the only game that we can play. And we're going to eliminate all other forms of physical competitive activity. That's the totalitarian urge, to take one manifestation of something and universalize it and say this is the only legitimate form of physical competitive contest, and it's the only game that we're going to play. That means all the other games that we play that are competitive physical contests, those will be abolished. That's the totalizing impulse. But in the postmodern condition, Lyotard tells us, is that we're able to refine our sensitivity to differences and reinforce our ability to tolerate the incommensurable. What are you saying that you can't? That you can only use your hands when playing a sport? You can also use your feet. And that's a different type of game with its own logic and its own rules. And we can live in a society as we do, in which you have multiple and different forms of physical competitive contest. That you don't have to just choose one. And there doesn't only need to be one that exists in a society, but you can have manifold forms. That's, for Lyotard, part of the postmodern condition. It's accepting difference. It's accepting multiplicity. It's accepting the fact that different games will be played in our society. And there isn't just one game, and the only one is the right one, and it has to be totalized. Lyotard linked postmodern science to a democratic, pluralistic, keyword, pluralistic social ideal. Pluralism. Well, many believe that Peter Berger did. Then in our society, we would see, it was a secularization thesis, that we would simply see a decline of religiosity. And ultimately, religion would become purely a thing of the past. But really, what we've seen, and there have been declines in religiosity, not so much spirituality, but religiosity we've seen. But we've really seen in our society a plurality of religions that coexist. The quest for a general theory to legislate truth, moral rightness, and beauty is impossible. Beauty, as they say, is in the eye of the beholder. Relative. It's coming to terms with the relativity of the lived experience. That there is that impulse, and it has always been that impulse, to create a totalizing truth that all must subscribe to. And that any competing truth is something that should be shunned or something that should be punished, seen as deviant. It's an acceptance. An acceptance of difference. No one standard can speak to the irreducible heterogeneity of the lived experience. The quest for systematic order is undesirable insofar as general theories create hierarchies that marginalize and repress social differences. The desire for a unitary and totalizing truth lends itself to the unitary and totalizing practice of the systems managers. That there's only one correct economic system, and that one correct economic system is communism. Right? And everybody is bound to the doctrine of the Communist Party. Right? It's the stifling. There's a great documentary right now on Netflix about the Cold War. But my gosh. And the struggle between East and West Germany and East and West Berlin. Right? Totalizing. Complete control. Because there was only one truth, and the only one truth is the truth of the party. The inability and refusal to form universal or totalizing truth is the sine qua non of the postmodern condition. That is to say, the essence of the postmodern condition. It's an acceptance of the fleeting nature of truth. That things will change. The eternal. What is eternal? What is it? And there, of course, there's a paradox in this. I mean, there is a truth that Lyotard identifies as the universal truth for our condition, and that universal truth, paradoxically, is the acceptance of difference, the acceptance of the coexistence of competing truths. Nostalgia for totality, utility, and consensus unavoidably leads to the imposition of uniformity and oppression. It's fascinating. You find this even in subcultures. And subcultures, punk is a subculture. Dick Hedges wrote a wonderful book on subculture style, right? And looked at punk as one of many musical forms of fashion. But as much as punks have been critical of conventional fashion, when you're part of the punk community, there are very strict guidelines as it relates to how punk should dress. That the irony to the subculture is that it's quite rigorous, it's quite rigid, it's quite controlling. And to deviate from the subcultural conventions is to risk ostracism and being expelled. So I guess the postmodernist then would just be able to appreciate the varied forms of fashion that exists and not feel the urge or the necessity to adopt any single one. But they're all different games that can be played. So postmodernism then lives with the reality of oppositions. It accepts this as our reality. Opposing forces, opposing interests. Okay. All right. Well, that was it. That was the last slide for today. We're down to one theorist, Wallerstein. We'll get to Wallerstein's work on Thursday, and that'll be it. So hang in there. You're close to the finish line.